Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 10 of our Why We Ride speaker series, the final week. My name's Eric, and I'm the program director here at Bike and Build. If you don't know about Bike and Build, we're typically running cross-country and regional bicycle trips every summer that raise awareness for affordable housing and empower young adults to become civically engaged. And so unfortunately this summer we can't run our trips due to the pandemic, but we are excited to continue our mission through a few different programs this summer, which includes the speaker series. Part of why we're doing this series is because housing is it's a complex cause. It's about more than just a home. It's intertwined with education, racial inequity, public health, government lending, transportation, accessibility, fair wages, zoning laws, and a lot more. And so through the series, we've been digging into the nuances of the cause, hearing from a diverse range of speakers who are all working towards a common goal of fair, decent, safe housing for all. So this week, we're going to hear from Colin Killick about his work with the Disability Policy Consortium and the Housing Advocacy Leadership Team in advocating for housing policy change for people with disabilities. Colin is the executive director of DPC, a Massachusetts-based civil rights advocacy organization run by and for people with disabilities. He began his advocacy work as a community organizer and graduate of the Join for Justice Jewish Organizing Fellowship before taking charge at DPC in 2019. He's a 2018 Master's in Public Policy graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he won the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Public Service for efforts to make Harvard more accessible and inclusive for students with disabilities. So Colin's going to be talking to us for a bit about his work for about 30 minutes or so, and then feel free to send any questions into the Q&A box, and we'll be pausing throughout the conversation to answer some of those questions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Colin.
Fantastic. Hi, folks. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, and thank you for that intro. So, yeah, I'm an organizer. I mean, these days, as executive director of a nonprofit, I spend far too more time than I would like dealing with finances and administration and other such things. But organizing, making change for the community that I care about, that I am part of, is really what drives me to do this. I have a disability myself. I have a couple of diagnoses. Neuromotor dysgraphia, which is a fancy way of saying I have very poor fine motor skills, as well as executive function disorder, anxiety, depression, garden variety things, though none of them visible. People don't look at me and presume that I'm disabled. And that means sometimes that people say things around me that they wouldn't say around someone they knew had a disability, which makes this an interesting situation. But since 2013, I have been fighting for disability rights. I've been doing it because I'm part of this community. I've been doing it because I feel a sense of moral debt, because I was only able to graduate from high school, let alone Harvard, because I got accommodations for my disabilities. I got the right to use a laptop in all of my classes and other similar accommodations, and I only got them because I had a civil right to get them, and I only had that civil right because disability advocates, people like Judy Heumann, literally took over federal buildings to protest for those rights, literally dragged themselves up the steps of Congress to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you haven't seen Crip Camp, it's on Netflix, go watch it. It's spectacular. It sort of tells this story. It's finally getting out. So I feel like I want to pay that forward to the next generation of young people with disabilities, because despite everything the ADA changed for people like me, our community is still the poorest minority in America, the least employed, the most homeless, which we'll talk about more going forward, make up 50% of those killed by police. So there are a lot of problems in the disability world. And one that you might not expect, but that is a real critical issue, is housing. I was actually at a healthcare forum a number of years ago, healthcare forum for people with disabilities. And the attendees were asked, what is the biggest healthcare challenge that you face? And the number one issue was lack of affordable, accessible housing. Because people with disabilities are twice as likely to be homeless as people without disabilities. That's a nationwide rate. It's actually worse here in Massachusetts, where I am. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is discrimination. We know that landlords are less likely to rent people with disabilities the Department of Housing and Urban Development and academic researchers have done studies where they send out paired testers, right? Someone with a disability, someone without a disability, presenting identical qualifications to rent an apartment, and people with a disability get turned away. So that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is accessibility, right? If you have a physical disability, and you need to find a place that is accessible, that you can get into in a wheelchair, where you can cook and bathe, get dressed and live fully independently, that's only a small fraction of the housing market, especially in cities like Boston, where I am, where the housing stock is old, because developments, new apartment buildings have only been required to have any accessible units since 1992. And a lot of the housing stock in this country was built before 1992. And single family homes, of course, still never need to be accessible. There isn't a town in the world, certainly not in the United States at least, where a single family home has to be at all enterable by a person with a disability. And the last one is affordability, right? I know you've heard throughout this series a lot about affordable housing. For people with disabilities, this is a real problem because our community is disproportionately poor. In fact, for a lot of us, if you need certain kinds of healthcare, if you need a personal care attendant to help you get dressed, or in and out of a wheelchair, or you need a power wheelchair, certain kinds of expensive medical equipment, the only insurer, public or private, that covers those is Medicaid. And in order to be on Medicaid, you have to be poor. So you have this dilemma where you have to be poor to get the benefits you need, but there is very little accessible housing. And the accessible housing there is almost never affordable. In the city, we have luxury apartment towers going up all the time, full of perfectly accessible units that nobody in our community can afford. And we have a small, crumbling stock of affordable housing that people with physical disabilities can't get into. And so my organization, back in 2014, settled on one potential solution to this. And that is a state program here in Massachusetts called the Alternative Housing Voucher Program. And this is a program it's a mobile housing voucher program, which means you get one of these vouchers, and then you can use it anywhere in Massachusetts. You find an apartment that meets your needs, that's under a certain level of rent. And you can present this voucher, and the landlord accepts it. You pay 30% of your income, whatever your income is, to the landlord, and the state makes up the rest up to this rent cap, essentially. So it is a degree of freedom. There aren't necessarily that many units that you can afford with an HPP voucher, but there are far more than you could afford without one. And you can find a unit that meets your needs. You can live where you want to live. So let me pause here before I go further and make sure if there are any questions before I launch into the story, really, of what we did regarding this program.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
How does that voucher program differ from Section 8? Oh, it looks like your audio cut out, Colin.
That's odd. How's that?
That's good.
Okay, the mic on my headphone seems to have cut out. I just go with the one on my laptop. Yeah, so part of it is the funding source. It's funded by Massachusetts state government rather than by the federal government. But also, with the exception of certain small pools of vouchers that are set aside, not many people with disabilities actually benefit from Section 8, even though we're disproportionately poor, because there are way, way more people who need housing than there are Section 8 vouchers. And when you're designing a program like that, you have to make certain choices. And Section 8 vouchers overwhelmingly are allocated to families, right? We have a priority for, we need to house families. We don't want children, especially, to be homeless, which is fair. It's absolutely fair. But people with disabilities are statistically a lot less likely to have kids for a variety of reasons, social ableism that I could get into, but it would take the whole time. But because of that, most voucher programs, Section 8 and also our larger general low-income state income voucher, state housing voucher, which is called the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, they have such strong family preferences that if you are a single adult with a disability, and especially if you're not a senior, because there are some options for seniors, but if you are a single adult with a disability under age 65, it's extremely difficult to get a voucher, even if you have a severe disability, because there are so many unhoused families, and even they wind up waiting for years to get something like a Section 8 voucher. So AAVP, this program, Alternative Housing Voucher Program, is relatively unique in that it does not have a family preference, and that it is only for people who have a disability and are under age 65, which is this very specific program that almost none of the other programs serve.
Thank you.
There's one question in the Q&A box.
Yeah, what other states have those sort of programs?
That's a good question. I know many of them do. I believe New York and California may both have them. I'm not sure other states. I mean, so Section 8 itself has that 30% rule, right? Most state voucher programs are modeled on Section 8 in regard to that income criteria. You pay either 30% or 33%, sometimes 35%, but it's somewhere around a third of your income, because it's sort of a rule of thumb that if you're spending a third of your income, which of course is still a lot, that constitutes being affordably housed. And if you are spending more than a third of your income on your housing, then that is your income burden. Then you are considered struggling to afford your housing. Of course, I know plenty of people around here who are paying 50, 60, 70% of their income towards housing when it gets really bad. And these vouchers, I mentioned discrimination, they were actually created because of discrimination, because people with disabilities were thrown out of the state's elderly disabled public housing developments. In 1994, the state put a cap on those developments said that only 13.5% of residents in those buildings could be people with disabilities under age 65. Everyone else had to be seniors. And this was because of fear-mongering around mental health, right? There were politicians trying to whip up the senior vote, promising to protect seniors in these developments from the scary, crazy people moving in next door. In fact, there's no statistical evidence whatsoever that people with disabilities or even mental health diagnoses specifically commit crimes at a rate higher than the seniors that are next to them. But there were a few well-publicized cases, and the state initially wanted to set it at 0. You just throw all the younger disabled people out of those buildings. It was a back and forth fight. Eventually, that was set as a cap, but the disability community of that era protested and fought, and eventually this compromise was struck that the state would create a housing voucher program so these people who were displaced could find somewhere else to live, which if they could find units that met their disability needs is not a bad deal, right? Younger folks with disabilities don't necessarily want to live next to seniors. This was created. And initially it was a really good program. The trouble is that the state swiftly lost some interest in funding it. And as anyone here on this call can tell you, I'm sure, housing has gotten a lot more expensive since 1995. So the funding for this program went down a bit, and the price of housing went up and up, up. And so in 1995, this program had about $4 million in funding and provided about 800 vouchers a year. By 2013, this program had just under $3.5 million in funding and provided 350 vouchers a year, less than half, and had more than 2,000 people with disabilities on the waiting list. Wow. And that's when we decided to get involved. I was a community organizer then at the organization where I'm now executive director. And my friend Allegra Stout, who was then a community organizer at the Boston Center for Independent Living, which is a local organization. So a quick tangent. If you know people with disabilities who are sort of looking for assistance, finding housing, finding services, getting personal care attendants, or who are looking to get politically involved in advocacy, you can Google name of your city, Center for Independent Living, because there is a national network of these centers. The first one was in Berkeley. They are typically run by and for people with disabilities, as my organization similarly is run by and for people with disabilities. And they both provide services to particular geographic areas, and they do civil rights advocacy on behalf of the disability community. And so my friend Allegra was an organizer at Boston Center for Independent Living. I was an organizer at Disability Policy Consortium. And together we started this group called HALT, the Housing Advocacy Leadership Team. And this wasn't made up of professional activists or people with, degrees in political science or people who had ever made a speech or talked to a member of Congress before. It was made up of low-income people with disabilities. Most of them either currently homeless or housing insecure, or formerly homeless or housing insecure. And we set a goal of restoring this program to 800 vouchers, which it turned out to take about $8 million. So we were talking about more than doubling the funding for this program in the state budget, a tiny program dwarfed by much larger ones, in an environment where funding for such programs was generally not going up. Every year they would say, well, it's a tough budgetary environment. And, what we had were, a 24-year-old and a 25-year-old with fairly limited political experience organizing a group of low-income people with disabilities. But what it turns out is that people who are actually affected by these problems have a lot more power than anybody realizes to solve them. Because while they don't have sophisticated political tactics, while they don't have piles of money for campaign contributions, while they don't have, sharp suits to show up in, they have stories. And politicians are either always either excessively idolized or excessively demonized. There are a few genuine angels in the legislature who will do things for you at the drop of a hat, and there are a few fairly despicable people who are, I think, largely in it for the money and the power. And the vast middle who are trying to muddle through and do what they can for their community and the people they serve in the midst of a not terribly transparent institution, and way more people coming to them asking for funding than they could possibly meet, given the amount of revenue the state has. And so what we did is we showed up in their offices over and over and over again for 5 years. And when we did, people told their stories of, sleeping in homeless shelters with their kids because they couldn't find an affordable place to live. Stories of being trapped in nursing homes, which is something that happens to people in our community, young people, people in their 20s and 30s, living in nursing homes, not because they want to be there, not because they have to be there, but because after an injury or an illness, the hospital sends them to a nursing home. And then they can't leave the nursing home until they can find an affordable, accessible place to move into. I've seen my friend Ann Johansson reduce hardened state legislators to tears, telling them the story of how she was in a nursing home in her early 40s. And she was told that she was not allowed to leave the nursing home in her power wheelchair to go to the library across the street because it was too much of a liability risk. That if she got hit by a car, the nursing home might be on the hook, so they wouldn't allow this adult woman to go to the library. And she was miserable and depressed in that nursing home, and she attempted to kill herself. But with the help of a housing voucher, she got out. She found a place to live independently. She got personal care attendants to help her get dressed and eat and go about her daily life. And now she has a full life. Now she's an activist. Now she is speaking to members of the legislature, and every year she throws a party for her care attendants and says, you know, they saved her life because they enable her to live the kind of life that she wants. My friend Olivia Richard told the story of getting out of a nursing home herself, but having to take an apartment, the closest she could find to an accessible apartment was one that she could get into in her wheelchair, but where nothing had been modified for her. So she one day was trying to cook on a gas stove like this, right? Down in a wheelchair, her arms up here on a gas stove. She's had her sleeve on fire. And she had to roll into the bathroom and throw herself into the bathroom, set herself out. And thank God she plays wheelchair rugby. She's got, you know, a lot of upper body strength, or she may not have made it through that, thankfully unharmed. And my friend Charlie Gargiulo told the story. His story. He looked around the rooms full of legislators and said, I was like you once. You know, 25 years ago, I had just gotten out of the Army. I'd gotten a good job. You know, I was in here in this building a lot, dressed up, talking to folks like you. I was a whiz kid on the way up. And then he developed severe depression. And he lost his job, and he lost his marriage, and he lost his house. And he was sleeping on, you know, people's couches, going from place to place. And he looked at them and he said, it could be any of you. If this hasn't happened to you, you got lucky. And all we are asking for is a chance. All we're asking for is a roof over our heads and the ability to start bettering ourselves, to have a stable place to live, to get mail, to look for a job, to take a shower and eat a decent meal and start rebuilding a life. And year after year, the funding for this program started to tick up. We got $100,000 the first year of an increase. We got $200,000 the year after that. And then, you know, we went forward and went forward. And then one year, we were grinding on these small amounts. One year, we got 1.05 million, the biggest increase this program had ever gotten. And we knew we had built the momentum. We'd established the relationships. The next year, we were on course for more than that. For both, we come in higher in both the House and the Senate. We were looking to make, we were going to land at 1.3, 1.4 million. And then at the last minute, the governor of our state pulled a procedural maneuver, told the conference committee, whose job it was to work out the differences in the House and Senate budget, that the revenue projections had been wrong, and they needed to cut almost $1 billion from the state budget. And poof, our increase went away. And that was the last year that I was running that campaign before I went off to grad school. And I was furious. I was screaming and cursing. I was punching the wall. I thought the whole thing had been derailed. We had failed in our goal of making it back to 8 million. And I had failed people on this committee, the people who were, some of them still homeless and wondering fairly why they had been doing all this work for all these years. And they hadn't gotten the housing yet, even though their stories had won all this money. But it turns out I needn't have been worried, because we didn't, even without that momentum, even without me, the project went on. When I left for grad school, we hired a brilliant young organizer to replace me named Lenny Somerville. And she took over the campaign. And the next year, we got some money. And the next year, we got some money. And last year, that program got $1.8 million in new funding. And that brought it to $8 million total. And that brought it back, give or take a few vouchers, to that 800 voucher line, that goal we had set in 2013. So I guess if there's a lesson in this, it's, I'm not here to tell any of you that, you know, you show up at the State House often enough and you can, you know, double the funding for the thing you care about, right? Success is not guaranteed. But I think it pays to not be cynical. We had no apparent power behind us, but we had organized people. We had the ability to connect. We had the ability to show up. We had a community full of people who could tell their stories. And when someone told their personal story and you would see a legislator being affected, those of us, we had done our research and we could say, now multiply that by 2,000 people on waiting lists. And we could say, look at all the money the state is spending. It costs $150,000 a year to put a person with a disability in a nursing home. It costs $10,000 a year to fund one of these vouchers. You could save money, making people a little less miserable. And year by year, we've chipped away. And homelessness is still a critical problem for people with disabilities in this state. And there's still nowhere near enough housing. We're pushing to take that program to 12 million. We're pushing through a bill that has been stalled for 20 years because the commercial real estate lobby opposes it. But we are trying to push through a bill that will require that when big apartment buildings get renovated, or when, as is happening all over the place here, when they sort of gut department stores or old factories or whatnot, or turn them into housing, that those units will have to be accessible, which current law requires they're not. And I have faith that if we keep up this, it may not be in my career as an advocate, but someday in this state, and I hope in this country, we are going to wake up to a world where being disabled does not make you more likely to be homeless. And if we do, it's going to be on the back of a lot of stories and a lot of shoe leather and a lot of showing up over and over and over again. So thank you. And I will be happy to take some more questions.
Thank you, Colin. Inspiring story, and so impressive, very impressive. We did have a few questions come up, both of them kind of related to definitions. And so the first is around disability. I know you mentioned kind of the rule of thumb is 30% of housing, of your income for affordable housing, which is defined by HUD. And so is there something similar with disability? And is it defined by what's in the ADA or something along those lines?
That's a great question. Yeah, the federal government has 3 different definitions of disability, and none of them agree with each other. Fortunately, for these purposes, the definition of disability is what is sometimes called the civil rights definition, or the ADA definition. It's the definition that's used to determine if someone has a disability for purposes of, are they being discriminated against, or are they entitled to accommodations, rather than do they get Social Security or Medicaid. Those definitions are far more restrictive. But this one is, I'll give you the technical definition and then what it means practically. The technical definition is that you have a condition which interferes with the performance of one or more activities of daily living, or a history of such a condition, or you are commonly regarded as having such a condition. So that's very broad, right? It means that, yes, someone in a wheelchair obviously is disabled. Someone like me with a learning disability or neuromotor condition or anxiety or depression is disabled. Someone with HIV is disabled. Someone with epilepsy is disabled. Someone with AED is disabled. Mental health conditions are all disabilities. And a lot of people who use these vouchers have mental health diagnoses. Developmental disabilities, autism is a disability, intellectual disabilities. It's really quite broad. Basically, is there something about your body or mind that makes it more difficult for you to show up in the world? And this actually, getting off on a tangent, we do have a little bit of time here. Another thing I would love to sort of leave you folks with is that this question of what does disability mean is actually something folks in the movement really talk about. And in particular, this notion of a difference between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. And the medical model of disability is the one that we're all kind of steeped in, the default presumption. I mean, most people look at disability. And the reason why most people, even people who have disabilities, don't look at disability as a political issue, as a civil rights issue, is this medical model. And the medical model says there is such a thing as a normal body. There is such a thing as a normal mind. And if you cannot access the institutions of society because your body or your mind is not normal, then the solution is to fix you so that you can access those institutions. And if you can't be fixed, then there's really nothing for you. Then you have to wait until you can be cured or treated to the extent to which you can access things. And I'm not knocking medicine, of course. It's done amazing things for people, extending lives, improving quality of life for people with disabilities. But for a lot of folks in the community, there's nothing it can do right now but keep us comfortable, right? You know. But there's another way of looking at disability entirely, and that is the social model of disability. The social model says bodies vary, minds vary. And the institutions of society do not arise naturally. They're created by people, by society. And when society creates these institutions, whether it's a physical building, you know, a school or a city hall or a bank or a house, or whether it's something like education is an institution, right? Civic participation government is an institution, right? Employment is an institution. When society creates these institutions, it chooses, when it designs them, what kinds of bodies and minds will be included and which will be excluded. And therefore, if you, because of the way your body or mind work, cannot access those institutions, that's not on you. That's on society. And it is society's burden to fix those things so that everyone can be included. And that is really kind of the animating principle of the disability rights movement. And I can give you an example from my own life. I know this is a long answer, but I can't write by hand at all, right? You know, I have a pencil here. I can just about sign my name with it, but that's about it. None of you could read my writing, and writing by hand for more than a few seconds at a time is intensely painful for me. Now, we are supposed to be living in a paperless society, right? We hear this term all the time. When there are options to complete something electronically, I'm just as included as everybody else. But when I say show up to the post office and I have to write something out by hand, I am disabled. Society is disabling me. It is saying that the ability to write by hand is a requirement for sending a package, right? If there was a touch screen and a label that I could print out and stick on, my medical condition hasn't changed whatsoever, but there is no longer a barrier to my participation in this because the system has been designed different. So a long answer to a short question, but I hope an enlightening one.
Sorry, my little chat there wasn't alluding to you talking too much. I was just there were two questions, and I think your answer there just answered two of them, and so that's what I was trying to clarify. So thinking back to the work that you did or were involved with as an organizer, what were some of the techniques you used to organize? You mentioned showing up all the time, showing up every day. Was there anything else?
Yeah, so there were a few, and there are some authors I would suggest checking out if anyone wants to get into this. I mean, Saul Alinsky, his work, did underlie a lot of this, Rules for Radicals. But then also Marshall Gans, who I took organizing from at the Kennedy School. He was Cesar Chavez's lieutenant in the California Great Boycotts. He kind of developed the modern school of community organizing as it is done in a lot of places. And then there are other models. There's the momentum approach, which I know a lot of people really like. But the way I laid it basically is it's about, the quote is, there are only two sources of power in this world: organized money and organized people, right? So if you're taking this organized people approach, it basically has there are a few ways of looking at it. The key things you want to do is you look at what is it that you are trying to achieve and who has the power to give it to you, right? In our case, it was, we want more money. We want there to be more of these vouchers to get people housed. The legislature has the money. They have the power to create this, right? And then we look at, okay, who has influence over the legislature, right? Well, there is the decisions of the whole legislature are made up of the individual legislators, right? You think about who has influence over them. Well, their constituents, right? People in their districts, right? They're supposed to list that they're their voters, right? So as much as possible, we try and find people who lived in the districts of important legislators to show up and tell their stories to them, because they have an entree. They can get in the door they have standing, right? And that helps. And we do that kind of identification, and you would go looking for allies, right? For partners. Who else might care about the things that we care about? Who could we work with? Who could we build a coalition with and help each other? Because more people apparently caring about something increases the odds of it succeeding, right? In an issue like this, it wasn't that there's an opposition who were fighting us, right? Sometimes there is, like our access bill, there really is. But this bill, this budget ask, it was just us trying to stand out from all the other people also asking for money in that budget. And so part of it was we wanted to get more people involved and to show more people care about this, that this should be a priority for legislators. And then the other aspect of this was being memorable and being moving. We wanted a legislator, when they were making the decision of what to support, to not think about this program as X many dollars for Y many vouchers. We wanted them to think about Donna and her daughter sleeping in that homeless shelter and what it could mean for her if she got housed. And so that stories were our basic currency. They were the most powerful tool we had. And as organizers, myself and Allegra, we, as much as possible, we're not the ones talking publicly, right? In meetings with legislators, we were there to frame things, to provide context. Public events, we didn't speak much at all, if we could help it, beyond making introductions and that kind of thing. Our role was to help teach the people we worked with how to tell their stories in the way that would have the most impact, right? It's about emphasizing, helping them learn, to pick out details, helping them learn to sort of talk about what this is important to them. How can this person they're speaking to help them, right? There's Marshall Gens talks about this as there's the village, the dragon, and the hero is the components of a good story, right? There is a village, there's this, this ideal situation, there's this positive thing that could happen, right? There's the state that we want to get to. There's the dragon that is threatening it, right? This negative force, this destructive thing that is harming people, that is doing damage, etc. And there's the hero, it's the thing that can come along and fix the problem and bring happiness and relate to those people. And in this circumstance, it's like the village is the people, right? The people being harmed, the people who and what they could have, the life that they could have. And the dragon is homelessness and inaccessibility and all the health problems and the dangers that come with not having an accessible, affordable place to live. And we basically make the case to legislators that the hero could be them, right? That they have this power, that it is within their power to make a change in this person's life and make them want to use that power, right? Make them feel like they can do this for this person. They can change this person's life who's in front of them because they can. And make them feel responsible for that decision. That they're going to have to make a choice. Do they help this person or not help this person? And this is not like asking for charity, right? This isn't, you see on TV that, look at this poor, helpless person, look at this orphan that I am speaking about, right? This is somebody speaking for themselves. This is them telling their story. This is them being empowered and talking, this person who may be sleeping on the street that night, who may have, not even a high school education, talking to a state legislator as an equal because they have as much right as that legislator to be in that building and to be in that conversation and to have a decent place to live. And they're saying to them, I need a hand up. Can you reach your hand out and pull me up? And those stories can work. And that was what we were doing when we showed up to those offices. And that's really the difference between something like lobbying and legislative organizing, which is what we do. Like, all our staff are technically lobbyists because they are people who are paid to influence the government. But whereas lobbyists for corporations show up and they offer campaign contributions, they offer, we can bring this many jobs to your district. We show up and offer the chance to do the right thing. And we hope that they take it. Was that helpful, I hope?
Very much so. Thank you. I think, so we have another question related to that. So you just laid out this all-encompassing roadmap of here's how you get from point A to point B. Here are some techniques and tactics to make change at this larger level, stories being a big part of that. But say I had something right now that I'm fired up about, what would be that first step towards making change?
Having conversations. There's a phrase that's used in organizing, the one-to-one, right? Which is a grand term for a conversation. But it's just a conversation with a purpose. It's good organizing campaigns are not about what one person wants, right? Not about one person's priority, but they have to start with one person. So you think about this and you identify somebody, and it's somebody else who you think might care about the same thing that you do, or somebody who knows about why this thing might be the way it is. And you sit down and you talk with them and you tell them your story and you ask them to tell you their story. Is a thing about you care about and why, right? Why does this matter to you? And you go in ideally with an ask, where if this person cares about this thing, the way that you care about this thing, then the end of the conversation you ask them, do you want to work with me to do this thing together? Do you want to try and figure out a way to solve this problem? And then they go and start talking to people. And you go looking for people with skills, people with knowledge, people with energy and time, and you build a leadership team, right? You build a small group of people you can trust who are willing to devote the time and energy to this cause because they care about it, because they're passionate about it. And as you have those conversations, you're both finding the people and you're clarifying your understanding of the problem, right? You are getting everybody's perspectives on this. And you may have your opinions change about the way to address this, right? But you are building that network of people and you're getting their networks of people. And you're going to find some people who are great public speakers, and you're going to find some people who are incredibly knowledgeable and good at research. And you're going to find some people, these are really valuable people, who seem to know everybody, right? Find those people and you're golden, because they will rope in all their friends. They'll know all the people they introduce you to. But you build that network of people. That's step one. And then I would say step two would be, once you do that, is start asking this question: what do we want? And who can give it to us? And who has influence over them? And do any of us, is there anything any of us can do to influence them, right? If there's a politician, they may have some reason to listen to you directly. Or it may be that they don't care about you, but there's somebody else, some other entity that they really care about, right? And they might listen to them. So like if you were, trying to get something done that seniors really cared about, or maybe this particular legislator or this particular company or whatever doesn't particularly care about your opinion, but they might care a lot about AARP's opinion, right? And if you can convince them to take a stand on it, then they can apply the pressure, right? And you start thinking about, so step one is talk to people, get the understanding of the issue, build a network of folks you can trust, who you can divide that responsibility with. And step two is think about, what are we trying to get? Who can give it to us? Who are our allies? And where can we have influence? And from there, bit by bit, you build a campaign. And when things go well, or when things go badly, you evaluate. You say, what did we learn from this? How can we change our tactics? You meet every week if you can, and you evaluate things. You come up with hypotheses, with plans, you test them, and you try again. And sooner or later, hopefully, you find the right people and the right stories and the right points of leverage to get it done. Sometimes it doesn't work. There's a quote that I think about a lot that is no less true for being from a Star Trek episode, which is, it is possible to make no wrong moves and still lose. That is not a weakness, that is life. But if you keep at it, sooner or later, you do tend to win. If you have the right people and the right tactics and the right understanding of the problem. And as with a lot of things, you get there by practicing. There are great books you can read. You can talk to fellow organizers, bounce ideas off people, have as many conversations as you can. And fundamentally, the longer you go, the more you think about this, the longer you packet a problem, the better you understand it, the more you're able to do with it.
Thank you for very clearly laying that out. So we have another question here, kind of changing course a little bit. So going back to what you mentioned earlier about, making the case towards lawmakers that cost $150,000 a year to house someone in a nursing home versus $10,000 for a voucher. And so this housing first concept, that paying for housing is actually cheaper than dealing with people who are in nursing homes, in emergency rooms, et cetera, has been around, but people are always resistant to it. It's happening right now here in Philadelphia. And so you are very good at making things very understandable. So how can the concept of housing first be easily explained to the public or people who are saying not in my backyard? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really great question. And like, I don't have necessarily a perfect answer for you. One of the first big shocks for me, like coming out, I was a political economy major in undergrad. I took a lot of economics classes, did a lot of statistical analysis. And I expected the first time I walked into a legislator's office and said, well, here's the data showing that it costs $150,000 for someone in the nursing home and $10,000 for one of these vouchers, that they would just, agree with me. That would be the end of the conversation. And it isn't necessarily. It's a really helpful data point, but it doesn't always help. But again, I would to make it personal, right? Most people, particularly folks who are, middle-aged people in positions of power, they have very probably had a family member in a nursing home, right? Or in some kind of facility, in some kind of institutional setting, right? So you might ask, like, have you ever had a family member in a nursing home? Like, because a lot of people have this experience of having to spend all of their money, right? Get rid of all their assets, paying for these places, right? And then you can compare it to, well, how much, cost. No one does that to rent an apartment, right? You don't see people like, middle class, income and such, spending every last dime they have to rent an apartment, right? People know intuitively to some extent what these things cost. They haven't just connected the dots. And the other thing I would say about the cost argument, right? Housing first, and you could also talk about, say, giving back to society, because it's not just that it's cheaper to put somebody in. You can use the values of the person who you're talking with, right? If you're talking to somebody who's a progressive, who's about, human welfare, human dignity, like getting someone, about civil rights, I wouldn't lead with cost, right? I would lead with, this is about human dignity, right? This is about, you wouldn't want to live in a nursing home, right? Don't you want to like be able to decide when you wake up and when you go to bed? Don't you want to be able to, go see your friends when you want to, listen to the music that you want to, and eat the things that you want to, instead of living under this regimented system, being an adult, being treated like a child, or being treated like a prisoner. And then say, oh, and incidentally, if the question is, then they say, well, this sounds great, but how do we pay for it? Then it's, well, you get people out of nursing homes, or even homeless people, and you can use data. There was a study in Rhode Island where they gave people, homeless people, free supportive housing and services. And they gave half of them that randomly, the other half they just tracked. These are people chronically homeless on the street. And at the end of the year, it was $9,000 per person per year cheaper to give people the housing and the services, instead of just leaving them on the street, because they had 2 times fewer mental health overnights, they had 3 times fewer emergency room visits, and they were half as likely to be arrested, right? And then it's like, we can either pay for people to be miserable, or we can pay for people to be happy and productive. With somebody who's more conservative, right, you can bring up the figures, right? You can, come with data, it's fairly easy to find online examples of nursing home rates, right? Examples of rents. And if you're pushing for a program, you can see, this is how many people it serves, this is how much it costs. It's a basic division problem. We can also talk about opportunity, right? Somebody who lives in a nursing home, does nothing all day, isn't really allowed to do anything all day. Someone who lives in an apartment can work, can pay taxes, can give back to the local economy. And people want to do that, right? People want to work, right? And these vouchers, it's not a free apartment. It's not a handout. It's, you give up 1/3 of your income, whatever that is, and the government makes up the difference, right? Like, surely it's cheaper to pay for 2/3 of an apartment, right? Whatever it is, than to pay for all of a bed in the extensive medical facility that is a nursing home. you know, if you find the magic formula to convince anybody that housing first makes good economic sense, please tell me. I'd love to have it. But those are some bullet points that I have found at least helpful in the past.
Thank you. I will bring those to these Reddit comment threads that I've been hotly following these past few days around some current events happening here in Philly. But that was the last question we had. So just want to say thank you, Colin, for joining us tonight, sharing your expertise and knowledge. It's been really inspiring to hear about your work, and I think you've shared a lot of knowledge for me personally in thinking about how to move forward and make change in whatever cause it is that I care about, and I'm sure the folks who have attended tonight feel the same way. So attendees, folks who have joined us tonight, if you have enjoyed what you've learned this evening and feel inspired to donate either to DPC, the organization that Colin is the executive director of, or to Bike and Build, Casey just threw some links in the chat box. And you can learn more about Bike and Build and DPC by following those links as well. And you can follow Bike and Build on Instagram or Facebook. Yep. So Colin, thank you. Thanks to everybody who attended tonight. And did you have any last words, Colin?
Yeah, it was my pleasure to be part of this. I put my email address in the chat box. If anyone wants to reach out, you're more than welcome. And yeah, I would just say, like, thank you for caring about this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about affordable housing as an issue. Doing this work, I see every day how important it is. And I would say, yeah, whatever your cause is, trust that you have more power than you think you do. And that that people want to hear your story, they want to hear your thoughts, and that you can change things. It just takes a lot of work, but you can get there.
Thank you. For folks who have joined tonight, so next week, this is our last formal speaker of the series for the summer. Next week, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be hosting a regular Zoom meeting because all of these have been webinar format. Everybody who's been coming to these sessions hasn't been able to see each other, talk to each other, talk about the things we've been learning. And so next week, we're going to be hosting this one meeting where we will all be able to see each other's faces and talk about the things we've learned over the course of these past 3 months, whether you've attended one, whether this is the only one you've attended, or you've been to multiple or all of this sessions this summer. We'd love to have you, and we can talk about affordable housing and kind of, yeah, what we've learned. So thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Colin, and we hope to see you next week.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Good night.